The American Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history and led to the creation of a breakaway country known as the Confederate States of America that existed throughout the Civil War. However, following the Union victory in the Civil War, the Confederacy rejoined the Union, and the Confederacy was based off of the Southern states and their desire to expand towards the Caribbean as well as parts of Central America and potentially even South America so that they could expand the institution of slavery and profit more so off of the exploitation of African American slaves in the Deep South as well as the Caribbean. The Confederacy also had a constitution just like the United States Constitution that was established during their 4-year period as an independent nation. The Confederate Constitution was established in Montgomery, Alabama, which was the temporary capital of the Confederacy when it was just down to the states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, before it was moved up to Richmond following the states of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas joining their cause. The Confederate Constitution had a preamble just like the United States Constitution, and its preamble had a few very key differences from the United States's. For instance, the Confederacy basically stated that each state would be acting in its own sovereign and independent character, which was something that the United States Constitution did not include, and the United States Constitution instead stated that the people of the United States would form a more perfect union. So this is actually the biggest difference between the preambles, which is that the Confederacy is more so leaning on the whole idea of states being able to act as sovereign and essentially be able to govern themselves. However, the United States Constitution is calling for the states to join together and form their own nation that is basically calls for national unity. The United States Constitution also includes the promotion of general welfare, which is something that the Confederate Constitution does not have. The United States Constitution also says that does not include the Confederate Constitution's verse, which is the favor and guidance of Almighty God. The United States Constitution does not have this. So this suggests that the Confederate leaders were more in favor of a religious government than a secular one, unlike the creators of the United States Constitution. Another key difference between the Confederate and United States Constitutions comes in Article 1, where the first thing you see is the Confederacy prohibiting immigrants from voting in Confederate elections, which is different than the United States, which allowed each state to decide for themselves whether immigrants can vote in elections. This is actually a restriction on states' rights that the Confederate Constitution implemented that the United States Constitution did not have. The Confederacy, however, did have naturalization laws that would allow certain immigrants to become citizens of the Confederacy, and these naturalization laws would be passed by Congress, just like the United States Constitution. And the Confederacy allowed only people of the age of 35 who were born in the Confederacy to become president of the United States, just like the United States Constitution. And yeah, that was a key difference in Article 1. The Confederacy also created a Senate and House of Representatives, just like the United States did. And the House of Representatives would be based off of the proportional population, and the Senate would be based off of it would be equal representation from each state, regardless of population. And when it came to the House of Representatives, just like the United States, the Confederacy adopted the infamous 3/5 rule, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person and free whites as one whole person. And another interesting provision, in fact, of the Confederacy's Article 1 is when it came to representation, they actually did not allow the representatives to represent more than 50,000 people, and they capped the amount of people in each congressional district at 50,000. So if the Confederacy survived as an independent nation and went on for 6 more years, and then Jefferson Davis's term expired, the next election would essentially have these numbers in the Electoral College for each Confederate state. Another interesting thing is when it came towards impeachment, the Confederacy, just like the United States, allowed the House of Representatives to impeach federal officials. Then the Senate would be able to remove them with 2/3 of the vote. However, they also authorized state governments to impeach federal officials if they were from their state. So, for example, take President Joe Biden. If we were following the Confederate Constitution right now, Joe Biden could actually be impeached by the Assembly of the state of Delaware. And the interesting thing enough is, 4 years ago, when Donald Trump was president, the state of New York actually had the power to impeach him if it were up to the Confederate Constitution. The Confederacy also authorized a line item veto, which is something the United States Constitution did not have. A line item veto is basically when the president can veto certain sections of a bill rather than vetoing the whole bill itself. The Confederacy also did not allow Congress to promote the general welfare, which is something they also didn't do in the Preamble. They excluded both of these ideas of promoting the general welfare the United States Constitution did have. The Confederacy also, when it came towards tariffs, they explicitly stated that tariffs were for revenue only, rather than promoting domestic manufacturing, which was in line with their whole view of free trade and tariffs for revenue only, as well as the idea that they were completely opposed to internal improvements, and in fact, in their constitution, they explicitly prohibited federal funds from going towards internal improvements. This was kind of a huge middle finger towards Henry Clay and his whole American system that basically sought for a active national government that would establish a national bank, promote internal improvements, as well as increase tariffs to promote domestic manufacturing. The Confederacy basically denied 2 of the 3 of Henry Clay's programs. However, interestingly enough, they did not have any part of their constitution that explicitly prohibited a national bank, and the Confederacy actually had a national bank during its tenure as a nation, and this is actually quite surprising considering how the Confederacy was strongly opposed to the idea of a national bank ever since Alexander Hamilton first promoted it in the 1790s. When it came to the issue of slavery, unlike the United States, which in its constitution had slaves be referred to as other persons, the Confederacy explicitly referred to slaves as slaves. And the other thing is, the Confederacy also explicitly prohibited any state from not allowing the practice of slavery, which was again a privilege that many states lost from the United States, which allowed states to decide for themselves, unlike the Confederacy, which prohibited states from not allowing slavery. The Confederacy also prohibited the international slave trade, just like the United States did after the year 1808. This was in the Confederate Constitution. And also, when it came towards exports that went from a specific state to a foreign country, the United States essentially prevented Congress from placing any tariffs or restrictions on states exporting to foreign countries. However, the Confederacy, on the other hand, allowed Congress to place restrictions or tariffs on state exports, with 2/3 of Congress being able to approve it. So this was another right that states actually lost. When it came towards appropriations, the Confederacy required Congress to pass appropriations bills with 2/3 of the vote, rather than just a simple majority like the United States Constitution did. Also, the Confederacy included the Bill of Rights in its Constitution, the exact same 10, which were freedom of religion, freedom of speech, as well as the right to bear arms, and the right against excessive punishments and torture. Basically, the same provisions in the Bill of Rights were extended to the Confederate Constitution. However, another thing about the Confederacy is that they prohibited the use of omnibus bills and only allowed single-subject bills to be brought up to the House of Representatives, and they prevented the whole idea of an omnibus. The Confederacy also allowed certain states to enter into treaties and negotiations with themselves when it came towards the issues of rivers and issues like that were related to rivers and trade along these rivers. They allowed states to do so, but in other cases, they didn't allow states to form compacts and treaties with themselves. Also, when it came towards the President of the United States, there were a few key differences between the Confederate Constitution and the United States Constitution. Just like the United States Constitution, which basically allowed for the creation of an electoral college to decide who the president was, the Confederacy did the same thing, and allowed states to decide for themselves the method in which they would use. However, the Confederacy limited the president to a single 6-year term instead of a 4-year term. So the Confederacy only allowed presidents to serve one term that was 6 years long. Also, the Confederacy authorized a cabinet and explicitly stated that the President of the Confederate States was allowed to remove capital officers based off of his own will and could remove cabinet officials based off of however he wanted, and didn't need approval from the Senate to do so. Also, the Confederacy created a Supreme Court and the same judicial branch that the United States did. However, Congress never actually created a Supreme Court during the Confederacy's 4-year tenure as an independent nation because of the fact that they were afraid that a Supreme Court would prohibit slavery or limit it. So, despite the Supreme Court actually being authorized by the Confederate Constitution, Congress never actually established it. And then they, of course, allowed the Confederate States of America to expand southward, and when it came towards the addition of extra territories towards the Confederacy and the creation of new territories, they allowed Congress to admit the territories for themselves, and they prohibited these territories from not allowing slavery. When it came towards constitutional amendments, the Confederacy actually allowed constitutional amendments to be brought up more easily than the United States did. However, instead of Congress being able to propose constitutional amendments, only the states could. This would happen if 3 states, in fact, wanted to call a convention, and rather than 3/4 of the state wanting to approve a constitutional convention, a constitutional amendment, and then it going to Congress, who would approve it with the 2/3 vote, rather, all that it needed for a constitutional amendment to be added to the Confederacy was a simple 2/3 vote of the states after being called into a convention by simply 3 states. So the process of approving a constitutional amendment would be much more easy in the Confederacy than it was in the United States. So there you go. That's basically the Confederate Constitution, how it worked, how it was different from the United States Constitution, how it was similar. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel.